The Chicago wind in October doesn't just chill the skin, it whispers through the skeletons of old estates. At the Riverside Manor, decades of human experience were being dismantled in a single afternoon. Sophia Martinez, a curator of the forgotten, moved through the Tudor halls, not as a buyer, but as a witness to the fragmentation of a legacy. The Williamson lineage had reached its silent conclusion. A century of secrets, triumphs, and quiet despairs were now reduced to ink-stained price tags. In the Grand Library, a sanctuary of mahogany and dust, the atmosphere shifted. Amidst the expected echoes of weddings and graduations, one silver-bordered frame refused to blend into the background. The silver was tarnished a metallic veil over a moment frozen in the 1920s. The portrait captured the archetype of the American dream, a young couple draped in the sharp geometry of the flapper era. The man, a portrait of structured ambition, the woman, a vision of graceful serenity. But nestled between them was the true gravity of the image. An infant swaddled in a cascade of delicate lace, a garment commissioned for a future that seemed boundless. On the surface, it was a masterpiece of Gilded Age prosperity. As Sophia leaned in, the perfect narrative began to fracture. While the parents projected an aura of radiant contentment, the child offered something entirely different. This was not the vacant, soft-focused gaze of infancy. Instead, the child's eyes held a haunting lucidity, an intensity that felt almost prescient. It was a look of profound awareness, perhaps even a subtle, instinctive recoil from the camera's flash. It was as if the child was the only one in the room who could see the invisible threads of the future. Driven by a professional intuition that bordered on the obsessive, Sophia secured the artifact. For $25, she hadn't just bought a photo. She had purchased an unsolved equation. Back in the sanctuary of her Lincoln Park studio, the real work began. With surgical precision, she prepared to deconstruct the frame. In the world of antiquities, the face of an object is often a mask. The truth is almost always etched on the reverse, hidden in the darkness where the light of the camera never reached. In the world of antiquities, the surface is a polite lie. The reverse is where the truth breathes. As Sophia peeled back the velvet backing, the silence of the room deepened. There, in the elegant rhythmic script of a lost era, were the coordinates of a life October 15th, 1920. The names followed Robert Catherine and baby Thomas Williamson. But it was the embossed seal that sent a jolt through her professional composure, Henryk Kowalski Photography Studio, the architect of shadows. Kowalski wasn't just a photographer, he was the visual biographer of Chicago's elite. He didn't just take pictures, he curated the public faces of the city's most powerful dynasties. His reputation for meticulous, almost obsessive record-keeping was legendary among archivists. Sophia knew that if Kowalski had pressed the shutter, there was a paper trail, a digital ghost waiting to be summoned from the archives. For the next 2 hours, the glow of the monitor was Sophia's only companion as she descended into the labyrinth of historical databases. The Williamsons were more than just a family. They were architects of the Gilded Age. Robert, a titan of finance. Catherine, an heiress to the iron veins of the American Railroad. They were the golden couple of 1920, sitting at the absolute zenith of their influence. But then, The scrolling stopped. The digital ink turned cold. A digitized clipping from the Chicago Tribune appeared like a fracture in the narrative. It wasn't a social announcement or a business triumph. It was an obituary. Thomas Williamson had passed away in November 1920. The math was chilling. This portrait, this image of health, lace, and legacy, had been captured a mere 30 days before the child's light was extinguished. In an era where medical science was still grappling with the mysteries of the human pulse, the cause was labeled with the vague, tragic terminology of the time. Sophia looked back at the photograph, but the context had shifted entirely. What she had once interpreted as intensity now felt like premonition. In the high-contrast silver of the print, the parents remained frozen in their beautiful, ignorant bliss, smiling at a future that was already dissolving. But baby Thomas, his gaze now felt like a silent transmission. Was it possible that the camera had captured a soul already standing on the threshold? The $25 relic was no longer just art. It was a haunting bridge between the pinnacle of a dynasty and its most profound private tragedy. Could a vintage lens capture a frequency invisible to the human eye? To answer this, Sophia turned to Dr. Elizabeth Chen at Northwestern University, a preeminent historian of light and silver. Dr. Chen's office was a cathedral of optics filled with the brass and glass of 2 centuries. When Sophia mentioned the name Kowalski, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Kowalski didn't just take portraits. Dr. Chen remarked, her eyes narrowing. He was an immigrant who brought a European obsession with the inner essence to Chicago. He was a master of the unspoken. The following morning, the 1920 relic was placed under a specialized spectrum of light. Dr. Chen moved with the precision of a surgeon. As the magnification increased, the world of the Williamsons expanded. The textures were hauntingly vivid, the weave of the mother's dress, the microscopic lace of the christening gown. But then, the focus shifted to the infant's face, and the professional detachment in the room evaporated. A child of this developmental stage, perhaps 4 to 6 months, should be a blank slate. Dr. Chen explained, her voice dropping to a whisper. Reflexive smiles, perhaps a wandering gaze. But Thomas, he is anchored. The magnification revealed a chilling clarity. The infant wasn't looking at the lens, and he wasn't looking at his parents. His focus was locked onto a specific coordinate to the left of the camera, a point in space that existed outside the frame. This wasn't the fleeting curiosity of a baby. It was a profoundly lucid reaction. As Dr. Chen adjusted the contrast, a technical inconsistency emerged. Kowalski was a purist of natural soft light, yet this portrait was bleeding with an unexplained luminosity. Look at the shadow geometry, Chen pointed out. There is a secondary high-intensity light source originating from the exact direction the child is staring. It's a harsh artificial glare entirely inconsistent with Kowalski's signature style. It's as if something blinding was present in that room, something the camera caught only in the child's pupils. Dr. Chen leaned back, the weight of the evidence hanging between them. In her decades of analyzing the Gilded Age, she had never seen a biological reaction this intense in a subject so young. When an infant shows this level of focus, Chen concluded They are reacting to an immediate physical presence in their environment. The question isn't just what the child saw. It's why the parents remained completely oblivious to it. The room went cold as Sophia revealed the final piece of the puzzle. The child was gone 30 days later. The realization settled like dust. The shadow the baby was watching wasn't a technical error or a fluke of the film. It was the beginning of an ending, a silent arrival that only the most innocent among them was capable of recognizing. In the quiet halls of the Chicago History Museum, the golden couple began to lose their luster. Sophia's research stripped away the socialite veneer to reveal a family in systemic collapse. Robert Williamson wasn't just a banker. He was a man navigating the jagged edges of the 1920s financial underworld. His name was whispered in the corridors of fraud investigations investments that had dissolved the life savings of the vulnerable. Meanwhile, Catherine Williamson was a woman retreating into herself. The archives spoke of nervous exhaustion, a vintage euphemism for a soul fractured by unspoken trauma. The pattern of loss, a recurring echo. The most chilling discovery wasn't a financial scandal, but a biological one. In the dusty ledgers of the Cook County genealogy section, Sophia found a shadow, Mary Williamson. 2 years before Thomas was born, Mary had arrived and vanished within 8 months. Her cause of death, identical to her brother's. 2 children, 2 mysterious endings, both occurring before their first birthdays. In the medical landscape of 1920, sudden infant death was often a catch-all term for a medical enigma that doctors were unequipped to solve. The reaction of the Williamsons to Thomas's passing was not one of traditional mourning, but of frantic departure. Within 60 days of the portrait being taken, the family had erased their presence from Chicago. They sold their Lakeshore Drive estate for a fraction of its value, a fire sale of a legacy, and fled abroad indefinitely. It wasn't a move, it was an exodus. They weren't leaving a home, they were escaping a site. The investigation eventually led Sophia back to the physical world. The Williamson mansion had been carved into luxury condominiums, but the bones of the structure remained. The current resident, Dr. Amanda Foster, was a pediatrician with a keen eye for the building's history. When Sophia called to explain the photograph and the pattern of the Williamson children, Dr. Foster's response was measured yet heavy with implication. "Come over," Dr. Foster said. "But you should know this apartment has its own way of communicating. There are anomalies here that the blueprints don't explain." Standing before the heavy oak doors of the former Williamson estate, Sophia held the 1920 photograph in her hand. She was about to step into the very room where Thomas had stared at the unseen. She wasn't just looking for a location. She was looking for the environmental trigger that had caused a 4-month-old to look at the world with the eyes of a weary old man. The mystery was no longer just about a photograph. It was about what was vibrating within the very walls of the Lakeshore Drive estate, something that had claimed 2 lives and sent a dynasty into exile. Dr. Amanda Foster's residence was more than a luxury condominium. It was a 3-dimensional archive. As Sophia stepped into the sprawling 3rd-floor estate, the ghosts of 1920 felt palpable. The high ceilings and Lake Michigan views projected the Williamson brand, success, stability, and social grace. But as a pediatrician, Dr. Foster saw through the limestone. She didn't see a mansion. She saw a clinical environment where a tragedy had repeated itself with mathematical precision. The air in the room grew heavy as Dr. Foster revealed the paper trail of despair. Among the bills and social correspondence sat a letter dated November 20th, 1920, penned just 5 days after baby Thomas was lost. The handwriting was a seismograph of trauma, jagged and desperate. I know in my heart that Robert, I cannot write the words Catherine had whispered to the page. The letter spoke of a father's cold eyes and a hidden cache of laudanum, a potent opium tincture tucked away in a private study. It described a chilling finality, Robert alone with the child for an hour, followed by the terrifying realization that the infant's skin was so very cold. Dr. Foster led Sophia into what was once the nursery, now a sterile home office. But behind a pane of preservation glass lay a biological confession. When the modern renovations began, they uncovered layers of history the previous owners had simply papered over. On the delicate floral wallpaper, Sophia saw them tiny, dark imprints. Fingerprints at crib height frozen in the adhesive of the past. But beside them were irregular amber-colored stains. I had those analyzed. Dr. Foster said, her voice clinical and cold. They tested positive for concentrated opium alkaloids. This wasn't a nursery. It was a controlled environment. In 1920, laudanum was the universal solution, a ubiquitous sedative for everything from a headache to a restless child. For a man of Robert Williamson's calculated nature, it was the perfect tool. The symptoms of a slow respiratory depression in an infant would mirror the era's vague understanding of sudden infant death. To the outside world, it was a recurring tragedy. To Robert, it was a liquidation of responsibility. The most damning evidence had been tucked into the very bones of the house. Sophia held the partial diary entry from October 10, 1920, just 5 days before the Kowalski portrait was taken. The ink seemed to vibrate with the realization that a mother was watching her world dissolve. The diary entry found beneath the floorboards was a jagged fragment of a mother's intuition. Catherine's words from October 10, 1920, painted a terrifying picture of domestic gaslighting. She spoke of Thomas's unnatural listlessness and Robert's sudden sharp aggression whenever the child's health was questioned. I've seen how he looks at the children when he thinks I am not watching. There is a coldness, something that frightens me. The entry ended in a frantic blur, as if the door to the room had suddenly opened. Catherine was no longer just a grieving mother. She was a woman living in a state of siege, documenting a crime she was powerless to stop. To confirm the atmosphere of that fateful October morning, Sophia descended into the climate-controlled vaults of the Chicago Photography Archives. There in Henryk Kowalski's 1920 ledger, the truth was etched in professional ink. Kowalski, a master of human observation, had noted an unusual family dynamic. His technical logs revealed a disturbing physical theater the mother described as visibly trembling, refusing to let the father hold the infant. The father characterized by sharp impatience, pushing to conclude the session with clinical speed. The infant Kowalski's final note was the most damning. He recorded that Thomas became visibly agitated whenever Robert approached, his tiny face contorting into an expression of instinctive, primal worry. The secret commission hidden within a folder of correspondence was Catherine's final, desperate act of resistance. 10 days after Thomas's death, she had written to Kowalski in secret. She wasn't just asking for prints. She was asking the photographer to preserve the evidence of her son's fear. "My baby's eyes in that final photograph," she wrote. "You captured something important. Please preserve it." She knew that the camera had seen what the law in 1920 would choose to ignore. The investigation eventually reached the desk of Detective Maria Santos of the Chicago Cold Case Unit. Though a century had passed, the patterns were unmistakable to a modern investigator. Santos identified Robert Williamson not as a grieving father, but as a family annihilator. In the high-stakes world of 1920s, finance children were often seen by such individuals as liabilities or obstacles to a desired lifestyle. By using laudanum, a substance that left no trace in an era without toxicology, Robert had been performing a slow, systematic liquidation of his own lineage. Sophia looked down at the $25 photograph. It was no longer a piece of antique clutter. It was a biological record of a crime. The infant's gaze, which Sophia had first thought was fearful, was actually something much more powerful. It was a testimony. Thomas Williamson had used the only tool he had his eyes to signal to a future he would never see. 100 years later, through the persistence of an antique dealer and a pediatrician, the sudden infant death of 1920 was finally reclassified by the light of truth. As Detective Santos navigated the modern digital archives, the tragedy of the Williamsons shifted into something far more calculated, a pattern of elimination. The records revealed that Robert Williamson's migration to California in 1930 wasn't just a change of scenery, it was the final act of a decade-long spree. After fleeing Chicago, he had reconstructed his life on the bones of another family. His second marriage to a wealthy widow in 1925 resulted in the mysterious deaths of 2 more children, ages 6 and 4, followed shortly by the mother herself. By 1930, Robert was a man of immense inherited wealth built entirely on the systematic erasure of those who stood between him and a fortune. The silence of a century was finally broken by Dr. Patricia Williamson, a retired psychiatrist and a descendant of Catherine's sister. She brought with her the missing pieces of the puzzle, the complete unedited diaries Catherine had smuggled out of Chicago in fragments, hidden in letters to her sister Margaret. These pages were a psychological roadmap of a woman realizing she was married to a problem solver who viewed human life as a financial variable. The diary entry for the day of the portrait session provided the ultimate context for baby Thomas's expression. I watched Robert's face when he looked at Thomas. Catherine had written with a trembling hand. The same expression I remember from when Mary was sick. A kind of cold calculation, as if he were studying a problem to be solved rather than looking at his own child. Catherine revealed that the formal family portrait was her desperate attempt to create a visual record of a life she knew was being extinguished. She had sensed the coldness and the life insurance policies hidden in the mahogany desk. She had seen the predator long before the world did. Sophia looked once more at the silver-framed photograph. The intensity in Thomas's eyes was no longer a mystery. It was an indictment. The child had been the only one in that 1920 library with the clarity to see the threat. Robert Williamson lived until 1954, dying in comfort, untouched by the law. But he failed to account for one thing: the permanence of the image. He thought he had buried his secrets in the Victorian soil of Chicago, but he had allowed his own crimes to be captured in silver and light. Through the persistence of a modern antique dealer and a grieving mother's hidden diary, the silent witness of 1924 finally told its story. The photograph wasn't just art, it was a delayed justice, proving that while the guilty may flee, the truth remains captured in the gaze of those who saw too much. The diary reached its fever pitch in the late autumn of 1920. Catherine finally found the courage to speak the unspoken. She confronted Robert about the dark, syrupy residue in the brown bottles, the sickly sweet scent of concentrated opium. His reaction was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, dismissing her clarity as another nervous episode. But Catherine was no longer a victim of his gaslighting. "I cannot stay in this house," she wrote in her final Chicago entry. "I cannot pretend to grieve with the man who took my children. Tomorrow I flee. Robert can keep his reputation and his stolen wealth. I only want to be free before I, too, become an obstacle in his path." 6 months after Sophia first pulled the tarnished frame from an estate sale pile, the Williamson portrait transitioned from a vintage find to a landmark of forensic history. At Northwestern University, scholars gathered for a symposium that would change how we view historical evidence. As Sophia stood before the enlarged image of baby Thomas, the room fell into a profound silence. Under the harsh glow of the auditorium lights, the infant's eyes, once dismissed as a technical fluke, were now recognized as the oldest living testimony of a crime. The survivor's legacy. Catherine's second life. Dr. Patricia Williamson revealed the final quiet chapter of Catherine's life. After escaping the gilded cage of Chicago, Catherine never looked back. She lived until 1965, dedicating her decades to the protection of vulnerable women and children, a silent penance for the babies she couldn't save. She lived in a world where a woman's word against a respected banker was worth nothing. She knew the police wouldn't listen, and the doctors would look the other way. So she did the only thing she could. She documented the truth and waited for a future that was ready to hear it. The most emotional moment came with the opening of Catherine's final envelope written on her deathbed. Her words across the decades were a plea for validation. If you are reading this, then Thomas's eyes have finally spoken. Please remember that he was loved. Remember that evil often wears a respectable face, but truth has a way of outliving the most powerful lies. Thank you for seeing what I saw. Thank you for listening to my baby's silent testimony. Today, the Williamson portrait doesn't sit in a dusty attic or a bargain bin. It hangs in the Chicago History Museum, no longer a happy family snapshot, but a monument to forensic truth. Visitors often stop and linger on the infant's gaze. They don't see a listless baby anymore. They see a witness. They see a child who, in his brief and tragic life, managed to stare directly into the lens and tell a story that would take 100 years to be understood. Sophia Martinez started the day looking for treasures. She ended it by giving a voice to the voiceless, proving that while history can be buried, it can never be truly erased.